China issued its #1 central document of the year on Sunday, outlining the long-term strategy for vitalizing the country's rural areas. How can resources be steered into China's rural areas without stifling progress in the urban areas? And India's latest economic survey reveals a deepening gender divide, leaving millions of so-called unwanted girls. What steps is India taking to address this gender preference? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. On Sunday, China released a package of policies under the so-called #1 central document of the year, charting the roadmap for the country's rural vitalization strategy. The plans include transforming rural areas into communities with strong agriculture, attractive landscapes, and financially well-off farmers in the next 3 decades. However, China's farmlands and rural districts are also facing a series of challenges that are listed in the document, including poor quality of agricultural produce, lack of competitiveness among farmers, and environmental concerns. How will China tackle these obstacles over the next 3 decades, and how can urbanization and rural vitalization be balanced? Sitting with me today in the studio are Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, and Xu Qingduo, Current Affairs commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Now, the #1 central document is traditionally the first policy document to come out in the year, which is seen as an indicator of the kind of priority the Chinese government gives to agriculture. And it is said that China cannot become modernized without modernizing its agriculture and rural areas. So for all of those watching us who have never been to China, please describe what is the degree of imbalance between urban and rural areas. Dr. Gao.
Well, this year we celebrate the 40th anniversary of China's opening to the outside world and political and economic reform. And the reform actually started 40 years ago in the Chinese rural areas by introducing the household responsibility system. And for quite several years, the farmers in the countryside actually achieved greater health, greater wealth, and in some cases faster than urban residents. However, since the urban area started the reform, great progress has been made in the urban area and eventually leaving behind the farmers. And right now, I think urban to rural disparity is normally at a range of 2 to 1. For example, 2 for the urban residents on a per capita basis versus 1 for the rural residents.
So it's quite a big gap.
It's quite a big gap. And it's not only just income, it also involves a whole range of things. For example, access to educational resources, health resources, elderly care, for example, and all kinds of recreational and sports facilities. And therefore, I would say the rural-urban divide in China is very big, and we need to do whatever we can to narrow or eventually bridge the gap.
Qingduo, what do you think people need to understand first if they want to understand the Chinese countryside?
Well, good point, Lu Xin. You know, if you take a look at the Chinese reforms in rural areas in particular, there's a great success, I would say. You would take a look at the rice crop. It hit a record in 2017, and this grain production has grown 40% since 2003. And if you look at China's output of cereals, you know, the per capita, like a hectare per hectare production is actually higher than that of Canada. That's unbelievable. But despite all of that, there's a huge problem surrounding this rural area. For example, you have this basically senior people and young children left behind, so-called holification in the rural area.
Because the
young men and women left the rural area and go find jobs in the urban area, and also, you know, plus we use a lot of fertilizer and pesticides, and then you have this, of course, the pollution of the soil and water. It takes a lot of time to treat those problems.
So indeed, China cannot become modernized without modernizing its
That's
agriculture
true.
and the countryside. However, what is also different this time is it gave out a long-term plan, basically a 3-pronged strategy to achieving the modernization of China's countryside. Dr. Gao, why do you think this approach is taken this time?
I think this year, 2018, is the first full year after the adoption of very important policy measures by the 19th Party Congress, which was held in October 2017. Therefore, this year is of critical importance in terms of implementing a whole range of important policy initiatives, including the policy initiatives announced in the first CPC Central Committee document issued on Sunday. Why? Because I think the farmers, the rural population in China as a whole, which still account for about 45% of the total population, are in need of major policy initiatives, and they really need to get out of the huge box in the countryside and share the great progress and achievements that China as a country and the Chinese nation as a nation have achieved over the past 4 decades. Therefore, the Central Committee apparently is using a long time span, that is the coming 30 years, all the way to the middle of this century, to chart well what need to be done, the roadmap, and all the policy initiatives necessary for the farmers to become more prosperous and better taken care of, and for the countryside to really be transformed on a massive scale. And I think this is very, very important for the farmers and for China as a whole.
A kind of a top-down design for the roads ahead in this period. This is also very interesting because China can make such long-term plans, right? Different from many other countries where the governments will be changed over a period of time. So we can do that. On the other hand, what is also interesting is instead of just focusing on agricultural production, for instance, or some individual areas of agricultural development, it has outlined a comprehensive approach, not just the environment, but also culture, but also people's income, but also agricultural production. Qingduo, why is this approach taken this time?
Well, you know, the #1 document for the beginning of every year over the past 50 years has been like agriculture. You know, in Chinese we call it the 3 issues related to agriculture. Basically, the ultimate goal is to build a strong agriculture, and then you have the rural area. Basically, we say beautiful landscape or attractive landscape. This is about the environmental protection and also ecological issues over there. And also the farmers. It's mostly about their income and also their welfare. So this is a long-term thing. You know, we have 3 steps, basically 2020, 2035, and then 2050. So it takes a long time to achieve all those goals. So I think this is also part of this like big picture of the Chinese development. You have strong economy, but your agriculture economy or rural economy is still very small, in like 9% of the total GDP. Well, you are hiring basically like 40% of the workforce. So this is, you know, you have a part of the big picture somehow is missing. You have to draw that element, and then you have a beautiful picture.
The relationship between urban development and rural development right now is very much in the spotlight, because for many decades, for 4 decades basically, there has been this flow of labor from the rural area to the urban areas. Statistics show that the population of migrant workers, or the population in the countryside, let's put it this way, China's urban residents population has increased from 170 million to 800 million in the past 4 decades. So urbanization rate has reached almost 60% from as low as less than 20%. So indeed, that's a huge jump. But what kind of challenge has that created for both the urban areas and the rural areas?
Talking about the numbers first, when we say the Chinese urban population is already accounting for up to about 60%, there is a caveat in that. That is, this 60% actually includes roughly about 10 to 15% of the population who are not permanent urban residents, who do not have their family registration system registered in the cities. They are still recognized as farmers or migrant workers. Some of them actually have been stuck in between urban and rural sides of China for many years, if not a couple of decades.
What challenges lie there?
Yes, therefore these people, they are really hard workers for the Chinese urbanization and development, but they do not have access or recognition as urban residents. They cannot really send their schools to many schools, for example, and they do not have urban residents access to health or other benefits. And sometimes it is really a struggle for them. Sometimes they need to overpay for sending their kids to school, etc. And I think eventually, when we count urban residents, we need to give full and equal access to all these urban residents, including migrant workers and their family members, to all the benefits that an urban resident would enjoy. But coming back to your question, I would say the increasing urbanization of China and the more and more people coming into the cities is actually a natural development. But the country needs to provide all kinds of benefits and conveniences and privileges, because otherwise we will have what we call megacity disease. That is, the cities will become more crowded and less efficient in terms of providing all these services to the people in the cities.
Right, but at the same time, there's also this effort to vitalize the countryside without human flow from the other way around. It's impossible to do that, Qingduo. What is China trying to do now?
What China is trying to do, especially in this specific documents, basically it will take measures. Of course, it's not specific yet what kind of measures the government is going to take. Basically, the governments at different levels to attract people, or city folks, let's say, to go to the country area, either to invest or to find occupation, find a job over there, or to live there. So, of course, in general, you would want to make the country area very attractive, with availability of, those natural public services, I would say. And also, there are job opportunities, and you have to, somehow make them, like, that's a realistic choice to live in the country area. So far, it's not that.
So the countryside not only has to catch up, but also has to be even more attractive than the urban areas. 22nd, Dr. Gao, please add what you wanted to add.
Yes, indeed. I think what we are talking about really includes the three key elements. That is agriculture itself, as Qingduo just now mentioned, but also the countryside and the farmers. So these three cannot be well taken care of, leaving any part out. So we need to take care of all these three key elements.
Indeed. Let's see whether the three-pronged plan will be carried out in time. Many thanks to my two guests, Victor Gao Zhikai, the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, and Xu Qingduo, Current Affairs commentator. And here is my first point. In his report to the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party last year, Chinese President Xi Jinping articulated the primary task of the Chinese nation in the next 30-some years to bridge the gap between imbalanced and inadequate development with Chinese people's growing need for a better life. To fulfill this task, vitalizing the countryside is absolutely essential, as the countryside is also where development has been lacking. Without a modern countryside, China's modernization will not be an inclusive one. In line with the three-pronged goal President Xi pointed out last year for the entire country, the government's #1 central document of this year mapped out the three-pronged goal for the countryside. And compared with previous agricultural policy papers, this one will be remembered as a milestone for its long-term vision and holistic approach. You're watching The Point. I'll be back right after this. Women in India are seeing deeper gender inequality, according to a latest survey released last week by India's Finance Ministry as part of its annual economic survey. According to the report, India's couples' preference for boys has led to the birth of as many as 21 million girls who are deemed unwanted. Abortions and the country's higher mortality rates for female children have led to a gender gap of about 63 million. million women. Will this latest report lead to any changes in this pattern of boy preference? Is India ready to address its widening gender inequality, and through what means? Joining me today in Beijing is Atul Aneja, China correspondent at The Hindu, and from New York we have Professor Joanne Cheng, a film critic and filmmaker. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Aneja, first of all, help us understand the situation. It does seem to be a rather grim picture, this 21 so-called unwanted million girls. Exactly what is the problem and what is the primary reason behind it?
Well, it is a very startling statistic. It's just like a wake-up call. It's not that we were not aware of the gender issue in India, but what it does give is it gives statistics, it gives numbers, so it sharpens our focus on this problem which has existed for a long time. Why does it happen? Well, I would say there are at least two major reasons. There are plenty others, but what I can think of is, one is of course the cultural inertia of this, the preference for sons to daughters.
How serious is that from a cultural perspective, that in the rural area, is there a difference between people in urban areas, rural areas, more developed areas, less developed areas?
Definitely. I think that diversity has to be understood, that it's not India is a subcontinent, so and also the uneven development which has taken place in India. So if you see regional and rural, north versus south, like northeast of India is the most progressive when it comes to land holding. For example, in one of the northeastern states, about 68% of the women own the land, and that the economic factor itself then translates into your cultural sort of preferences or otherwise. It's not the same in many of the North Indian provinces. We call them states. Now, why does this happen? I think it's very important to understand this. When a child is born, and I'm talking of a traditional family in not the progressive side or not the non-urban side.
Average, let's say.
Average in certain regions. Now let me put it that way. Now, the daughter seems like a burden to them. And the reason for that is that there is this practice of dowry, which is when the woman is to be married, then you have to pay a certain amount of money. So she becomes the economic burden right from the beginning. By contrast, if you see a son seems to be your social insurance for the old age, because if you empower the son, then he gets good job and he has the disposable income. And that sort of gets leveraged into looking after the parents when they get old. Now these are traditional kind of mindsets, but we do have, or at least have, an economic basis of the past. As urbanization takes place, as more and more women also become earners and start making money, there is a mismatch between the cultural inertia of the past and the objective conditions which are rapidly changing as well. And this you see very, very, very strongly in some of the urban areas. For example, in the 1970s, the average childbearing of a woman was about 4.73 on an average. This has come down to around 2 now, which is like France or any European country. But this is the developed metropolitan side of India.
Sure.
So the problem which also arises is that in areas where you can afford good quality and upbringing of a woman, there the gender conscious, there you are having less children being produced, and it's happening more where services and your ability to educate the women is less. There the population is sort of rising more.
Indeed, it's a rather complex, mixed picture. Yes. A lot of different level of development, urban areas, rural areas, so the discrepancy is quite big. Professor Cheng, from your understanding, you come from a Chinese background, how much similarity is there between the Indian picture in son preference with the Chinese picture?
Well, I do see a lot of similarities between these two cultures. China has just recently, a few years ago, relaxed its policy of one child. Now we can have 2 children. But before this, a girl was always not the choice of the family. But with the modernization, we are moving into a new century, 21st century. I believe the consciousness of women or consciousness of male, together as a society, we should move forward. I do see China is making great progress in presenting opportunities for women, and I'm quite surprised to hear that India is still somewhat lagging behind, at least in the rural area.
Mr. Aneja, while we're talking about this problem of a gender divide, we also have to acknowledge that India also produced very prominent female politicians, for instance, and top leader, for instance, a prime minister, something which China does not have yet. So how would you describe the kind of almost two extremes that we're seeing here?
Well, if you look at women's empowerment, it has a very grassroots appeal. In the sense, it's been more bottom-up approach than something which has been sort of state-enforced. And in the modern era, you can trace it to the freedom movement of India, where Mahatma Gandhi mobilized his Mahila Samitis, which means women's organizations, as part of a rising India, or of an aspirational India going for its freedom, where women would be seen as a part of the workforce. And it was a very radical step, so it has a history of its own, and there were a number of women icons who played a very major role in our freedom movement. For example, there was a lady called Aruna Asif Ali. We had what was called the Quit India movement. We wanted the British to quit. And in a park in Bombay, she unfurled the Indian national flag, and she became an Indian icon straight away. We had the first UN representative, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, under Nehru, who was, again a woman. So there was no, first of all, it's a bottom-up approach. Second thing is, for young women growing up in India, there's no shortage of role models. Even today, Indira Gandhi is still 70s, but today you have India's defense minister, a woman, and you have the foreign minister as a woman. You have the communications minister as a woman. So, because of its large size, though in pure numbers, statistics may not look good, but there are enough number of women who have got empowered and done very well, and now have become role models for an aspirational India whose average age is 29. Young women want to do as well as men. Right. So my hope for India, and I'm absolutely confident about this, is that the sentiment has changed. The momentum has shifted, because there are opportunities through globalization and others in jobs, and women are aiming for the sky.
Yeah. What are the measures that the Indian government has been taking to address the gender divide which we were talking about, and how effective are they?
Well, there have been schemes which have been run by the government all the time, and since the time of my school age, I can remember them taking place. But as I said, those do have a sort of, they flag the point basically. But the real change starts when there is a change in consciousness among the women. Mm-hmm. And to me, the hope is that consciousness is demonstratively changed. And you can see this in terms of that there was about 2 years ago, 2012, of rape of a woman in a bus. And the outrage it caused among the women, that this is a progressive and India which has a sense of equality enshrined in its fundamental rights, and they're not going to take this anymore. So the change in consciousness, more than any other government scheme, is something, and you can see this. If you see the top corporates in India today, I'm talking about the banks, insurance companies, they're all women CEOs. So you can see this getting translated into action. Long way to go, big problem. Still 29% in the workforce, not enough. But the change in consciousness is where the hope is.
Professor Chung, hearing what Mr. Aneja has said, what are you making of it? What do you think is maybe the experience or the lesson we have to learn from India in this perspective?
Well, I quite agree with Professor Aneja's point of view of the change in consciousness. I think asking equality with men, I think is a self-liberating process that we need to initiate from the point of view of the women themselves. We cannot wait for men to give us liberty and freedom and happiness. It is indeed our own destiny we need to take into our hand. I think women need to evolve the consciousness of self-liberation, liberating from the source that is our understanding of life. We need to become the dreamer, a dreamer for a better future. We need to have a voice, and we cannot just rely on men or anybody else to change our destiny. And I think we need to understand this is the fundamental challenge of 21st century in terms of equality of gender.
What do you think is the most effective way to raise that consciousness from your perspective?
I think everybody need to get on the journey of enlightenment, and we need to understand ourselves by learning from maybe philosophy, maybe religion. We need to get into a zone of trying to understand in addition to economic prosperity, a society need to have awakened beings. And I think women, as the ultimate incubator of lives, we are at the very top in terms of hierarchy, although men sometimes put us down. But we're actually at the very top of a society that very nurturing. So we need to become enlightened by ourselves. I think having a good film is very important. A society very much influenced by mass media. I think the education system is also another key. We need to educate young girls since young. I mean, even with when the baby in the womb, mom need to hum a song. I mean, to try to liberate this child since birth. So from childhood to womanhood or to motherhood. Throughout this process, women need to be educated as an equal of men.
Right. Professor Anija, 30 seconds if you can. Where would be the next thing, the most important energy needs to be put in by the Indian government? 30 seconds, please.
Yes. One is education and opening up of jobs, which will consequently follow. I think education is the key, but the right kind of education which makes women employable. That will be a game changer.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Atul Anija, China correspondent at The Hindu, and Professor Joanna Chung, a film critic and filmmaker. And here is my last point. Both as developing countries in Asia, China and India face similar challenges in terms of sun preference, although the extent of the problem is different. Actually, I was born because my mother wanted a son after having 2 girls already. She gave up after I was born, and I don't think she ever regretted that. So if I look around, there are also similar cases within my friends, my colleagues. As the report released by the Indian Ministry of Finance indicated, development is not automatically solving the problem. Factors dating back thousands of years could be collectively responsible for the challenge. Nevertheless, when girls are given the opportunity to learn and to be independent, the situation will become better. The key for the government is to set the right policy to make development inclusive and raise the public's awareness about the problem. The publication of such a survey is a courageous first step. That is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.